Dear friends, have you ever felt like a voice crying out in the wilderness, or a voice crying out in the desert? I'm sure most of us have, because most of us who have lived long enough have experienced dark moments in our lives. We have experienced days and months when things were not going well for us. The happy days seemed to be over, and life seemed to become so difficult. And we feel like we're in a wilderness. And we feel like a voice crying out in that wilderness. The voice is crying out for answers. And the answers don't seem to be coming. And I would say most of us, if we honestly look at our lives, we can look back on days when we had an experience like that. Maybe some of us here this evening are going through an experience like that. In the Gospel of today's Mass, we read about John the Baptist. And he's referred to as a voice crying in the wilderness. John the Baptist lived in the desert. He fasted every day. He prayed all the time. But he was a voice crying in the wilderness, in the desert. But his voice was different. The voice of John the Baptist was not a voice of hopelessness. It was not a voice of helplessness. It was a voice that was full of hope. It was a voice that was full of confidence. Many, many people came to hear him. Thousands of people flocked to hear John the Baptist preach, because they could hear something different being said. This man was full of hope, and he was offering this hope to the world. He was announcing the coming of the greatest hope that the world has ever known, Jesus Christ. He was preparing the way for Christ. And he was telling people that Christ is the answer. He's the answer to all our problems. If we get to know Christ, we get to know the answer. That's what John the Baptist was telling the people. Very prominent and successful program in our world today is Alcoholics Anonymous. It is said that Alcoholics Anonymous is a church without walls. It's a strong spiritual movement, and it has traveled all over the world. And it has been said that it's the fastest growing church in the world. And it's leading countless people to God. And the alcoholic is a person who has lived in a wilderness. He lived in the wilderness of alcoholism. And sometimes that went on for years. But he lived in this terrible wilderness where he couldn't live without the alcohol. And everything around him was falling apart. His family were suffering. And then he's led to an AA meeting. He faces up to the fact that he's an alcoholic. He admits it for the first time. Up to that point, he did not want to admit it. He didn't want to face the fact that he was an alcoholic. But now he faces the fact, and he starts going to the meetings, and he discovers God. He discovers the higher power, and his life has changed. He begins to walk in a new direction. And miracles have happened through that program. Those people who are living in the wilderness have found the light. They found God. They found Jesus Christ. Their lives changed completely. And we all experience the wilderness to some extent. And we experience much more wilderness than we realize. But there's always an answer. There's an extraordinary answer. And the answer is Jesus Christ. But like the alcoholic, we have to be honest. We have to face our wilderness. We have to admit that we're in a wilderness. We mustn't run from it. We mustn't pretend that we're not in a wilderness. And if we face our wilderness, read our scripture and read spiritual books and be very honest, we discover there's a voice. And it's not a voice of hopelessness. It's not a voice of discouragement. It's not a voice of despair. It's the voice of Jesus Christ. It's full of hope. It's full of joy. And Jesus wants us to be free. He wants us to come out of our prisons. He wants us to know a joy that we've never known before. So, in our wilderness, let us not continue to listen to our own voice, our voice of discouragement, our voice of hopelessness. Let us be honest and listen to the other voice, because the other voice is an extraordinary voice, and that is Jesus Christ. And he wants to lead us home to a land of freedom and love and life. St. Paul said on one occasion that where sin abounds, the grace of God doth more abound. What St. Paul was saying is, even where sin seems to dominate, and where evil seems to be rampant, the grace of God is alive right there. And it's more powerful than that very evil. And where darkness abounds, the light of Christ doth more abound. And that light of Christ wants to serve us. It wants to be with us. It wants to be ours if we open up to it and not stay locked in our despair.